Let me now turn things over to the reason you're here, Irshed Manji in conversation with John Avlon. Their bios are in the program. They hardly need introductions in any case. But let me note that just today, John wrote a terrific piece on this very event, topic, and Irshad's book in the Daily Beast called Islam's Civil War. These are big topics. These are striking words. Love, war, Allah, liberty. I can think of no one better to mull them over with us. Please join me in a hearty welcome to Irshed Manji and John Avlon.
It is a great pleasure to be here with you tonight. A dear friend, a brave soul, and a terrific new book. It is a great, important, and timely conversation, and it's so great we're having it here. It's part of a civic conversation, a civil dialogue, 10 years after 9/11. And as you and I have discussed many times, there is still, 10 years after the attacks of 9/11, this struggle at home and abroad between freedom and fundamentalism. And you are squarely on the side of freedom, and I thank you for that and everything you do. Absolutely. It's amazing, though, that 10 years after 9/11, there are still few topics that we tiptoe around more than Islam in America. And as you experience in your daily conversations online with people at home and abroad, the way this has become so polarized. And I want you to talk a little bit about that, because on the one hand, we've seen the rise of politicization of Islam. I think, in retrospect, I think the immediate response of George Bush and Rudy Giuliani and other people tampered some of that down, because they made it very clear that was not what was going on in this country. But we've seen a rise of Islam as a political football. Some people fueled by hate, issues that distract. And on the other side, this sort of paralyzing political correctness that refuses to deal with the facts of the larger struggle that's going on within Islam, and then Islam, some Islamists against the United States. Talk about your place in that intersection.
So that's a softball, right? We'll start with the easy ones first. I don't yet know, John, what my place is in that intersection, except to say that when you thank me for being squarely on the side of freedom, I thank you and God for allowing me to wind up in a society in which I can do that relatively safely. Without any exaggeration, every morning, I wake up thanking Allah that as political refugees, my family and I were accepted onto the precious soil of Canada, my country. And I say in Allah, Liberty, and Love that we were literally handed our freedoms along with our winter coats. Okay? We didn't fight for these freedoms. We didn't take up arms for them. We didn't shed blood for them. They were gifted to us. And I tell you, that is in part why I feel not just my right, but my responsibility to use these freedoms in as constructive a way as I know how, but to use them, lest they atrophy. So what is your role, you ask, in this intersection? When I say use my freedoms constructively, I do believe that that means reconciling my beloved faith of Islam with this gift of freedom, rather than believing that there has to be a showdown. I don't believe there has to. Some on the left and some on the right do believe that. Taking the position that I do can be very difficult, because it's not black and white. And yet, how do you convey the same message to the same audience, knowing that your audiences will be comprised of people who have very different values from one another? How do you convey that singular message and be heard? I have not yet mastered.
But you've done more than anybody else, probably. I mean, as a bridge builder between faiths, as a place that the emails you publish in Our Liberty and Love are striking, especially from young Muslims in America and around the world who are finding your words surreptitiously sometimes through free translations that are on your website because they can't get the books published at home. And the way that they long to hold on to their faith, which they love so much, but reconcile it with the modern world. I'd love to read just one email to start out with, from a young man in the College of Sharia within Al-Azhar University in Egypt.
Right. And this is like the Harvard of Sunni Islam. Okay, so we're talking a very, very elite university, and it's the College of Sharia Law.
I'm studying at one of the greatest Islamic universities, but yet no one is using their mind or critical creative thinking. I can't say what I think, feel, or want about hijab, Jews, etc. If I say what I think, I will be accused of being a kafir, an unbeliever. Then my family will get hurt, or my family will hurt me. Let's talk about that.
I deliberately did not print his name in the book because, of course, the atavistic environment in which he exists at the College of Sharia at Al-Azhar University, he would very easily be found out. And again, God knows what would happen to him as a result. Maybe nothing, but maybe quite the opposite. But I loved the fact that he emailed anyway, and he put his name. Might have been made up, but he put a name in that email. And he said at the end of that email, I'm going to be an imam, prayer leader, and I will be proudly a reformist imam. And I will support Jews, and I will support women, and I will support gays. Pretty good start. Now, he's obviously young, he's a student, but I have to tell you that I don't think he is unrepresentative of the generation and the secular Democrats, really, of the generation that began the uprisings that have taken up so many of our headlines, quite rightly so, over the last number of months. In May 2005, I was in Cairo, found myself observing and then pulled into what was then the biggest demonstration against government authoritarianism. And afterwards, I hung out with a bunch of democracy activists at a cafe, spoke with a number of them, and one of them in particular really stood out for me for this reason. She comes up to me and she says, I know you from the international interviews that you've done, Irshad. Thank you for what you're doing, but I need to ask you something very privately. I said, sure. And she said, well, the thing is, I've fallen in love with a Jewish man. And I don't believe he needs to convert to Islam, and he doesn't believe he needs to convert to Islam. And here I am, sticking my neck out, putting my life on the line, really, to support a political change in my country. But what's more scary to me is talking to my parents about my love for this Jewish man. And she asked me for advice. And this was part of a wave, I found, of emails coming to me by young Muslims or non-Muslims who had fallen in love with one another.
What did you say when she asked for advice?
I said, oh my God. I said, look, give me your email address. I'm going to stay in touch with you. But I also said to her, I can tell you that you're not the first person to ask me for advice on the question of interfaith marriage. And I'm sure you won't be the last. And we talked about the fact that we're now living in an age of mass migration, where Muslims, for example, are winding up in places like Europe, either because they've been born there, their parents are immigrants, or because they're going there for jobs and such, until very recently going there for jobs. And they're encountering non-Muslims and falling in love, of course. So this is a red-hot 21st century issue. And because her question was just part of the wave of questions that I was getting about this very phenomenon, I said to her I'd get back to her, and I ultimately did, but here's how I did that. I realized after the 14th or 15th time I got this question that my emailing these kids back to say, this is my interpretation of the Quran, wasn't going to cut it. Because it's not them I need to convince, it's their elders. So I went to an imam, a progressive imam here in America, and I asked him to exercise ijtihad. This is Islam's own tradition of critical thinking, of independent reasoning. And I asked him to exercise this tradition within Islam to reinterpret the very verses in the Quran that have traditionally been used to prohibit, especially women, from marrying outside the faith. He did that, and he came up with a concise, 2-page defense from an Islamic perspective of interfaith marriage. I posted it on my website in English. Now, here's the kicker. In only 6 months, it became such a popular download that I had to get it translated into 20 more languages, okay, including most of the European languages. I said that's a kicker, but actually there's a further kicker to all of this. In 2007, I was lecturing in Berlin, not about this issue particularly. But after everybody had gone, a group of young Muslim women living in Berlin approached me to say thank you for posting this interfaith marriage blessing. And they said thank you as well for translating it into Turkish, German, and Arabic. Because we're at marrying age now. Our parents are putting the pressure on us to marry only Muslim men. You know, individuals we mostly don't even know, let alone love or like. And by putting this interfaith marriage blessing in front of them in all 3 of these languages, they can't tell us that they've got to, that they can't understand it. There is no linguistic excuse for them to simply dismiss it. And the fact, they said, that you've gotten an imam to write this, they said, at least my parents know, and I know that there is one theologian in this world, and likely more, who is willing to marry us. They said that made all the difference for them. So the upshot of all of this, if I may say, and it goes back to the email that I got from this young man at Al-Azhar University, is that this is such a fascinating time to be a reformist within the faith of Islam. 10 years ago, before these technologies were readily available, posting translations on your own website and so forth, I could not have imagined having the kind of breadth and impact with this work. I shudder to think what the next 10 years will hold. I can barely keep up with what's going on now. But now is the time to be doing and undergoing this kind of mission.
That story you just told gets to the heart. I mean, that gets to the heart of Allah, liberty, and love. And the trends that are driving all the changes we're grappling with, all of us, in our own societies, in our own tribes, which we need to transcend. That's the big idea, I think.
That's the idea of moral courage, right? Is the willingness to speak truth to power within your own tribe, within your own community, within your own circle, for the sake of a greater good. And by the way, that's not my language. That is Robert F. Kennedy's language. And the reason he emphasized speaking truth to power within your community first and foremost is that that is where the backlash will be most painful. It's one thing to stand up to the so-called other. Whatever, crap you get from the other, you can withstand. You can go back to your own so-called and say, look at what I'm doing to stand up for us against them. I know where I belong. But the moment you call out your own community stuff, their injustices, their abuses of power, the security blanket of instant belonging disappears.
That, I think, is the heart of what is going on in politics and geopolitics today. It's that pressure. Really, I think it's the driving force of technology, and globalization is making people transcend their tribalism. And the people who are deeply committed to it are in a defensive crouch, and they're latching out because they know deep in their heart that they're on the wrong side of history on this one.
Well, and I don't know that they do know that they're on the wrong side of history, but I think the dogmatists do know how insecure it all is for them. And this is why, I have no problem saying that I'm a faithful Muslim, which is not the same thing as being a dogmatic Muslim or a dogmatic Christian or dogmatic anything. Faith, it seems to me, John, is secure enough to handle questions. Faith never needs to be threatened by questions. Dogma, on the other hand, of any kind, is always threatened by questions because dogma, by definition, is rigid and brittle, and it snaps under the spotlight of scrutiny. And quite frankly, therefore, in my view at least, deserves to be threatened by questions.
I agree. Let me ask you this, because we're in a moment where you look at the work you're doing, the broader hope of the Arab Spring, and there's a question of calling on new traditions to justify these new directions. And one of the most fascinating things in your book, I thought, was this sort of forgotten tradition of tolerance within Islam. All these leaders and thinkers and the culture that had coexisted so beautifully with other cultures for so long Talk a little bit about that tradition, where it went, and how it can be rediscovered.
Well, okay, so yet another easy one, right? But
Sorry.
1,000 years ago, roughly speaking, Islamic civilization led the world in curiosity and creativity and ingenuity. And I don't think there's any mystery why. Ijtihad, again, Islam's own tradition of creative reasoning, was in fact the order of the day. We know that so much of what we in this part of the world take for granted as products of secular European culture, in fact, was started through Muslims and believing Muslims at that. When I say believing, they were driven not so much by doubt as by wonder. So one of my heroes within Islamic history is a philosopher, and he was so much more than just a philosopher, but broadly speaking, a philosopher named Ibn Rushd, after whom, by the way, Salman Rushdie's father renamed the family Rushdie, Ibn Rushd. And he was a polymath, and well into the 1600s, Italian universities, for example, were absolutely enthralled with Ibn Rushd. And I make the point and back it up in the book that through him, all sorts of scientific experiments were then undertaken, leading ultimately to the craze that we have in this part of the world with, frankly, science fiction. Even John Milton, the great English poet, took a great deal of inspiration from innovations that led and can be traced directly back to Ibn Rushd. So again, transcending religious borders as well. How do we rediscover that? Without putting too fine a point on it, that interfaith marriage blessing that I just talked about, notice that the imam whom I approached to reinterpret these verses of the Quran exercised this very tradition, to update the interpretations of verses that already exist. I am not talking about rewriting the Quran. No, the words are what they are. But interpretation is about drawing meaning from those words. And we can draw, in fact, I think we should draw new meanings for a brand new century, brand new, pluralistic context in which the vast majority of us now live. And let me just say one other thing, if I may. Why should we? Why should? I mean, we can, but why should we? It really does go back to my abiding belief in Allah, in one God, not God's self-appointed ambassadors. It seems to me, and I realize that, not everybody in this audience believes in God, and I don't think God minds. But it seems to me that any deity, any creator worthy of worship, doesn't manufacture widgets and automatons. A creator worthy of worship produces individuals who give themselves the permission to grow. Because that creator is not insecure, quite the opposite. Welcomes that growth, I believe, because when we use our creativity, we pay tribute to the creativity of that which created us.
So, given all those dynamics, given that opportunity, that obligation to grow, your central core struggle is reform, is to reform Islam, a reformation that has been long overdue to make it thrive in the 21st century, in the modern world. That is the least softball question in the whole world, because, of course, there's nothing bigger than that. That struggle, that fight is at the core of almost every issue we deal with, in at least much of geopolitics. How do you feel that effort to reform Islam is going today?
I read some of the comments underneath the article that you wrote for the Daily Beast about Allah, liberty, and love. And a number of them said, well, bully for her courage, but I don't see anybody following. I don't see anybody, taking up the struggle. She's a lone voice in the wilderness. If they read Allah, liberty, and love, they'd know that that's simply not true. And this is what gets underreported for many reasons, not the least of which is, and I don't begrudge this, it is what it is, it's just, good Muslims, so-called, saying wonderful things is simply not as sexy as the bombings and the beheadings.
Right.
And I totally get that. But I must make the point that just because you're not reading about the incipient reform movement within Islam does not mean it doesn't exist. You know, I recently came back from Europe, where I was speaking with a growing network of reformist Muslims. This network didn't exist 3 years ago. Okay? Now these people, these individuals who were earlier working in their own silos in isolation, are actually coming together to recognize, number one, that they're not alone, and number two, to see how they can support one another. And if ever we needed any, I guess, you know, sort of tangible evidence that voices like mine are not alone, look only again to the secular Democrats who over years, not overnight, over years, which means persistence and commitment, instigated the so-called Arab Spring. Whatever may come of it in the next several years, they're the ones who brought other sectors of Egyptian and largely speaking, North African and Middle East society to these uprisings. So I know that voices like mine are not alone, but what I also know, John, is that in an open and pluralistic society like America, like Canada, like much of Western Europe and Australia, people like me have platforms that so many others don't yet. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to make sure to reflect the voices that we typically don't hear in Allah, Liberty, and Love, because they deserve to be amplified, so that you can see that there is real hope, not merely theoretical hope.
And technology is allowing those folks to shrink the distance, to start communicating and aggregating. And what are some of the countries that you have seen these networks start bonding together? Not the Arab Spring itself, but this effort specifically about reform in Islam.
Well, let's go to Europe again. And why Europe? Again, some would say, well, that's not, the Muslim world. Well, au contraire. I mean, right, the fact that there is so much Muslim migration, to various countries in Europe, from Sweden to Norway to Denmark to Germany, France, Belgium, Holland, Italy. The fact that there are young, I'm going to say, because it's true, European people who happen to be Muslim, who love their faith, but who define themselves first and foremost as Europeans. Because being Muslim, they insist, and I agree, should not be a contradiction with being Muslim. And what I find so fascinating is that what we in this country would call liberals, which in Europe means something very different, but let's say, for the sake of argument, let's say progressives, people who believe that in their humanitarianism they are moving society forward. I have found, and these reformist Muslims have found, that in fact a lot of the pushback to calling themselves Europeans comes from people who define themselves as progressives. Why? Because many of these self-defined progressives believe that it is their multicultural duty to attach these young Muslim Europeans to the cultures of the parents and of the so-called old world. Because when we do that, we're paying tribute to the roots of these young people. When in fact, many of these young people are saying, hey, that's my parents' culture. That's not my culture. I'm European no less than you are. And so it's not just the right wing that, challenges the ability and the capacity of young Muslim Europeans to integrate. You certainly get that too. But make no mistake, you also get this feel-good, gooey multiculturalism that in the way that it's practiced, it's not the idea that's the problem, it's the way that it's practiced that winds up becoming a very strange and tawdry bedfellow with the right wing. And I think, people who are on the opposite end of the right need to look at themselves as well and see whether they're advancing the cause of integration as opposed to assimilation.
Right. Let me ask you about one of the other major topics and a whole chapter in your book, which is moderate Muslims, so-called moderate Muslims. And you really take them to task for not unequivocally condemning the violence that's committed in their faith's name. And I'm always, a lot of the work I do, the writing I do, I'm very proud to be a centrist. I talk about the vital center. And yet there's a major distinction with those folks who are fighting for reform, trying to reconcile differences, but fighting for progress, and people who are sort of a split the difference, let's try to diminish the conflict and ignore the moral conflict of our time. That context, on the one hand, you had this real experience of being called a bigger criminal than Osama bin Laden, in your mother's mosque. On the other hand,
when my mother was there, listening to the sermon being given, the khutbah being given by the presiding imam.
They've had an awkward moment. I mean, it doesn't get more. But this larger problem too of self-described moderate Muslims, some of whom have moved into the West, who are unwilling to clearly condemn violence committed in their faith's name.
So, John, it's not so much that so-called moderate Muslims do not clearly condemn. They've learned to clearly condemn. Public opinion has pushed them to do that. That's not the issue. The issue, I find, is actually twofold. One is that moderate Muslims usually don't acknowledge the role that religious inspiration plays in the very violence that is committed in religion's name. So, for example, when Major Nidal Malik Hassan in Fort Hood, Texas, opened fire on his fellow soldiers. Now, this is key. It's not the fact that he was Muslim that's key. Put that aside. That he was shouting, Allahu Akbar, God is great, as he was doing this. This is what is important. Clearly, there is some religious inspiration that has driven him to this crime. But the first thing that we heard out of the mouths of organizations, that claim to represent moderate Muslims was, no, don't misunderstand. Islam has nothing to do with this. Now, I put myself in the shoes of a non-Muslim American, and for that matter, some Muslim Americans. And I can well imagine why many of them would say, wait a minute, okay, here's this guy with the words Allahu Akbar dripping off his lips as he's shooting his fellow soldiers, and you're telling me that Islam has nothing to do with this. I'm confused. And when you ask those questions, moderate Muslims, in my experience and in the experience of many of the reformist Muslims with whom I've been in conversation, again, put up the wall and say, you're not allowed to ask those questions, respect me, which really is a euphemism for don't challenge me and don't make me uncomfortable. Okay? So I believe, and this is the finishing flourish on my argument here, I believe that if moderate Muslims were willing to hear the questions and to address the questions honestly, that actually suspicion among many non-Muslim Americans would lower. Because then many non-Muslim Americans would say, okay, great, I get to have a discussion with you about this. If I don't get to have a discussion with you about this, then I'm asking myself, what do you have to hide? What are you afraid of? And then that raises defenses all over. The other point I just quickly need to make about moderate Muslims, because I said that there are two problems here. So one is that they usually don't acknowledge the role that religious inspiration plays in the violence that's committed in religion's name. The other problem is that I find moderate Muslims are so consumed with their Muslim identity and the purity of that Muslim identity that they wind up playing the game of identity politics, meaning that you don't define yourself for all that you are, but you define yourself against the other. Okay? So that the moment something is asked of you that makes you uncomfortable, makes you antsy, as a Muslim, you immediately take offense to it, and you decide that your humanity is being challenged. Whereas the reality is that disagreeing with one another's ideas does not mean denying one another's humanity.
Yeah.
Okay. So those two barriers need to be addressed very squarely. And the irony here is it's not going to happen without a lot of defenses going up. Okay? But we have to be willing to confront that and call out the political games.
And you write a lot in the book about that interplay, because, as you said earlier, the sort of these well-intentioned, politically correct progressives who end up empowering that kind of behavior, making it more difficult to have an honest dialogue, right, when in fact the right thing to do is to take that leap of faith to have an honest conversation.
And I'm glad you say leap of faith, because that actually is the right phrase. But faith in what? When you challenge me, John, as a non-Muslim, if you're challenging me about my spiritual or religious beliefs, my take is that you actually have faith in my capacity to think critically. You're treating me as an equal. You're treating me as a peer. You're not treating me as a child. You're not infantilizing me. That is respect. Whereas on so many university campuses today, it's the very fear of being challenged that has corrupted this notion of respect. So the wall goes up, the hand goes up, you're not even allowed to, ask me a question, and I will define that as respecting me. That's reducing me to something much less than I'm actually capable of.
So in that spirit, let's bring that back to the 10th anniversary of 9/11, those conversations that we don't have enough. Because one of the dynamics, we have a growing, thriving immigrant Muslim population, but we have something very different that has happened, because at the same time this population is growing and there's a religious component, normally in traditional waves of immigration, it would just be a question of generations. There would be acculturation, there would be integration. And I think those dynamics are at work too. But of course, this wave of immigration coincided with an attack on our country that was committed by people saying they were acting in the name.
And that's the key. It's not just that they were Muslim. Again, we can put that aside.
Right.
It's that they did this in the name of Islam. So I'm glad you phrased it that way, because that's absolutely important.
So the question, I guess, so many people have is it has reduced our ability to have an honest conversation about real questions about integration. And I think that is the larger stake. We will evolve toward a more perfect union, but what are the stumbling blocks? Is this indeed different? One of the concerns people say a lot, and sometimes they say it in ugly ways, is the Islamic faith compatible with democracy? Is Sharia law compatible with the Constitution? How can that work out in the United States of America going forward?
Well, I welcome pushback on this point, but I believe that the Islamic faith and Sharia law are not the same thing. And well, for me, it certainly is. But also, let me just make the point that, again, in this country, there is a sort of, oh my God, Sharia kind of, reaction, right?
Especially in the current political environment.
For sure. And I get that and I hear that. Sharia, though, isn't one thing. Sharia can be defined in many, many ways. And can be defined quite benignly, and believe me, I'm not making the case for Sharia. Please, I'm not making the case for that, okay?
We noted at home.
Okay. I am a secularist myself, meaning that I very much believe in the separation of organized religion and organized politics. But my point simply is that it's more nuanced than the oh my God Sharia types would have us believe. Now, how can Islam be reconciled with the democracy and the constitution that we've got in this part of the world? One of the things I point out in Allah, Liberty, and Love in every chapter is that there are plenty of passages in the Quran that actually support freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, and freedom of expression. And what I find so interesting is that conservatives, both Muslim and non-Muslim, often say to me, well, as a liberal, you're just being selective. That's true. I am being selective. But how are you not being selective when you ignore the freedom-friendly passages of the Quran? You see? So again, it's all in the interpretation. And I will tell you very briefly that the case that I make, and it's not a theoretical case, it's a very practical one, for why Allah, God, not God's mullahs and imams, rabbis or priests or ministers, but God. Why God is compatible, why Allah is compatible with liberty, very briefly, if I am to believe in one God, then I also believe that that God has the full and final truth. Not me, not you, and nobody in this audience has the full and final truth, which means that we need to accept that we've got limited knowledge, which in turn makes it a spiritual obligation to contribute to societies in which we can disagree with one another in peace and with civility. Why? Because anything less means that we're playing God with one another. And that, in a monotheistic faith, is the real sin, if you can put it that way. So the beauty here is, or the upshot is, that believing in one God obliges me, quite happily so, I might add, to defend human liberty.
And that becomes, I guess, the bigger question. In the larger evolution, the idea of America, there is this idea, e pluribus unum, out of many one, that ultimately we do transcend all our tribal differences and come together. And that is, I think that's the promise of America, and it's being fulfilled every day. The question, I think, becomes, when you look at the waves, at the different generations of Muslim Americans here in the United States, and you see those teenage girls you talk about in the book whose freedom is being, in some cases, viciously restrained by brothers and fathers who feel that they are protecting the child's honor. Do you have some broader degree of faith that the culture will work? Not benign faith in culture, because you point out individuals make decisions, cultures don't.
Exactly.
But that America will work in effect, that over time, if we can reason together and talk together, that process of acculturation, of assimilation, of integration will occur with the Muslim American community as it has with every other.
I do have faith. I don't think that I could continue this work if I didn't. But make no mistake, it's not just a matter of waiting it out. Every cultural change requires catalysts, requires people with moral courage to speak up when everyone else wants to shut them up. And I bring it back in one of the defining paradigms of Allah, liberty, and love, one of the lenses through which I view the challenge that Muslims like me have in front of us and non-Muslims have to link arms with us. One of the lenses I use is the modern U.S. civil rights movement. You know, Martin Luther King Jr., if you haven't read lately his letter from a Birmingham jail, please do. Refresh your memory about this awesome document, because one of the sections of the document, it's not just a point he makes, it's an actual section that he devoted in the document, is devoted to moderate Christians. And he points out to those moderate Christians that in times of moral crisis, and he of course was referring to Christianity in the 1960s, in times of moral crisis, moderation is a cop-out. And so he was exhorting moderate Christians to stop being so tepid and timid about the need to end segregation. He was calling them out on their own hypocrisy. And if you apply that analysis to what is happening within the culture of honor that has frankly colonized the faith of Islam, the culture of honor in which a young woman, I tell the story in Allah, Liberty, and Love, a young woman, lesbian, 18 years old, Muslim, living right here in New York, emails me out of desperation. She's on the verge of suicide, but she can't commit suicide because she knows she's going to go to hell if she does. Okay? So she's literally in this limbo in which she's saying, I'm going to go to hell anyway, and yet if I kill myself, I'm going to go to hell for sure and faster. And she says, I don't know what to do. And she ends off her email to me by saying, you'd think that because I live in New York, I would have freedom. No. She ends off her email saying no. And the backstory to this is that she has grown up with her parents' culture, which comes from Southeast Asia. I won't, again, name the country because, you know, I don't want her being found out. But her parents are trying to marry her off to a Muslim man from that country, their country, not her country, their country. She doesn't know who that person is and doesn't want to, you know, go there. But she doesn't know how to tell her parents that she really is something different than what they're used to, okay? And so she's asking me to talk to her parents. And I say in the book, I ain't queer enough to show up at their door, okay? You know, call me what you will, but, yeah, right? But I do ask reformists, what will you do to help her? By the way, speaking of moral courage, though I won't tell you what country her parents come from, she insisted that I use her real name. real first name, Bushra. Okay? And she said, people need to hear this story because it's not just in Pakistan and it's not just in Bangladesh and it's not just in Libya where the culture of honor, of group honor, collective honor, of protecting the family's honor comes into play. It's also right here in the United States within our own Muslim communities. Now notice, by the way, that I talk about culture. Okay? It's true. Culture is not religion. There is such a thing as, tribal culture of honor, which, by the way, propped up the U.S. Propped up slavery in the United States many years ago. That, too, was a culture of honor. So you apply that analysis to what is going on, okay? It's true it's not the same as Islam, but that's nice to say in theory. The reality is that, there are times when a Muslim father, and again the story is told in my book, Muslim father of a Canadian girl who happens to be Muslim and refuses to wear the hijab, the headscarf, puts his hand on the Quran, a religious document, and swears that he will kill his daughter the next time she refuses to wear the hijab, and he does. And he kills her. Now, you can tell me all you want, but that's culture. Great. Tell that to the dead girl. Okay? If we're going to say, as Muslims, culture is culture, faith is faith, we bloody well should act as if that's true.
Let me ask you a final question before we take questions and emails. And it's the role of women's emancipation in changing that culture. You make eloquently the distinction between faith and culture. Faith is love, and culture too often can be corrupted by hate. What role does increasing women's rights, women's education have in changing that culture from within?
Women, I believe, are the key. But I'm not the kind of person who says, I've never been, in fact, the kind of feminist who says, give them all the power and the world will change for good. No, women are human too. Okay, women are people too. We too can be corrupted by power. Because at the end of the day, we are still individuals and we are still human beings. So obviously, a fairer distribution of power is needed. But make no mistake, it is needed. And I think it has now become more acceptable in liberal and progressive circles to make that point. There was a time a few years ago when, again, you'd be called a self-hating Muslim or an Islamophobe or an enabler of the right, when you make the point that women themselves within the world of Islam are rising up to reclaim the very rights that the Quran, interpreted in a certain way, does give to them. It's more acceptable to do that now, and for this I'm very grateful. But make no mistake that, again, it's all good in theory. Let's see whether the role, for example, that women have so arduously played in the uprisings in Egypt and Libya now pan out in the way that men are willing to share power or not with women as new political regimes and systems are put together.
That's a big idea. Let me, before we take questions, I want to read my favorite quote from the book, I think. Because it's all about an individual taking a stand of moral courage as a way of creating new possibilities and ultimately healing the divisions and the self-definitions and divisions that I think are destroying our country. And not destroying our country, destroying our causing so much conflict in our culture at home and abroad. You say, people who act on their moral courage will always encounter disapproval. To have moral courage is to challenge conformity within our own tribes, be they religious, cultural, ideological, or professional, and to do so for a more universal good. That doesn't get any better than that. Thank you for everything.
Thank you, John.
And let's take some questions. Let's take some questions from the audience and then also from the Twitterverse, because we already have some really good ones.
So we've got, just so you guys know who this is coming up to the podium, Annie McWilliams is the associate director of the program that I run here called the Moral Courage Project. And so Annie will be our tweet gal, and she will interject every so often with a question from the Twitterverse. Yes. And from Facebook, I think, as well. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Great. Yes, sir. Stand up and please take the microphone.
You mentioned, Irshad, that 1,000 years ago,
Roughly.
there was this sort of openness and exchange and exploration. A book about New York City, island in the center of the world, talks about how the Dutch influence, the commitment to diversity that existed at that time in the Netherlands, planted a seed here in New York that was different from the Bay Colonies and the kind of witch trials and so on. How was it lost, this thing that was in Islam 1,000 years ago? And are there lessons for us in America who kind of treasure our openness and diversity and so forth and our commitment to it?
Such a great question. Thank you for that. Very briefly, the tradition and the preeminence, not the tradition as such, but the preeminence of ijtihad, of critical thinking and creative reasoning in Islam, was lost for pure political reasons, not spiritual and not theological reasons. Again, bottom line it, there was much going on within the vast Islamic empire roughly 1,000 years ago. And because there were different denominations popping up and different interpretations popping up, the caliph, the statesman at the time based in Baghdad, decided that in order to keep the empire together, we need to crack down on these various interpretations. Now, again, keep the empire together, that's a political motive, not a spiritual one. And so these crackdowns began, and amazing philosophers like Ibn Rushd, many others besides him, but just as an example, were threatened with death and sometimes put to death. He himself suffered his demise under very, very suspicious circumstances. And because these great thinkers no longer had the option, really, if they wanted to save their own lives, no longer had the option to ask questions, what happened was that unity came to be confused with uniformity. And for reasons I explained actually in my previous book, The Trouble with Islam Today, that problem has persisted for hundreds of years, very much, with some exceptions, of course. Again, history is not linear, but few enough exceptions that the dominant theme has been the narrowing of the gates of ijtihad. And that problem has followed us Muslims to this very day. And yeah, I do think that there's a huge lesson here, and probably several, to be learned by America. One of them, and again, I don't want to sound like a liberal flake when I say this. I may be a flake and I may be a liberal, but I hope I'm not the two together. That you'll make your own judgments, I'm sure, in the spirit of ijtihad. But that Americans ought to realize that part of, in fact, a huge part of what the world still loves about this country. In fact, John, when I go to Europe, to this very day, I tell you there is no exception to the rule I'm going to give you right now. At least one young Muslim person, and often many more, in my audiences quietly say to me, Irshad, could you bring me back to the United States? Could you bring me back with you? And by the way, when they were saying this during the Bush administration, I'd sort of, I challenged them. I'd say, what? Despite the Patriot Act and Guantanamo? And they would often say to me, yeah, those are unjust, but that's not America. That's not really America. In America, I can be so much more than I'm told I can be here in Europe. Okay? So understand that what so much of the world still loves about this country is precisely the second and third chances, the ever-perfecting union. And that unity, cannot and should not be conflated with uniformity.
Beautiful. Let's take another. Yes, ma'am.
One of the most... Is it turned on? Oh, one of the most...
Thank you.
Third time lucky. One of the most acrimonious debates we've seen about Islam here recently is, of course, the debate about the so-called Ground Zero Mosque. And, of course, I would say the highest decibel voices in that debate, it was maybe not the most productive dialogue. Could you comment on what would have been an alternative to the loud voices we heard during that debate?
Right. Great, thank you. Well, and I think that the conversation, since the so-called Ground Zero Mosque is not going away anytime soon, I think the conversation can, in fact, become a conversation rather than a series of dogmatic monologues from, both camps, okay? But I think that the only way we're going to get to the point of it being constructive is when individuals stop merely reacting to those who take an opposing view, stop emotionally investing themselves in hating the other person's view, and take a step back and take a deep breath and look within and ask themselves, am I opposing or supporting this mosque project on its own merits? How do I know what I'm actually supporting or opposing? What questions am I asking about it? And one of the questions that I suggest in Allah, Liberty, and Love is, ask the imams or the developers or the people who are behind this mosque, what side of the mosque will men come through? Because if they answer, oh, it'll be this side or it'll be that side, you know that segregation is going on. And if you think as a liberal that by supporting something like that, you are actually upholding liberalism, that's pretty kooky, okay? But there are other questions to ask as well. The imam who used to front this mosque project, and again, left under very mysterious circumstances. In fact, John has done some investigative reporting about all of that. He has pointed out, or he did at the time, that this project will be based on the Jewish community center model. Really? Because, Salman Rushdie has spoken at many Jewish community centers. Where do I sign up for my advance tickets to Salman Rushdie's lecture at the so-called Ground Zero Mosque?
That was one of my favorite lines in your book, actually.
Where do I? And he's not going to be invited. I know because I've talked to the people who are behind it. Okay. Well, if you've got a comment, you'll have to make it into the microphone, all right? So, rather than simply taking positions because I want to tick off the crusader on the other side, that is just a battle of dogmas. Okay? That gets us nowhere except deeper into the muck. Ask questions. And here's the key. Ask them out loud, where they can actually become useful to society and not just to your own inner dialogue.
Got a question from the Twitterverse.
Yes. I have a question here from Iberian Phoenix, who tweeted, is there anything non-Muslims can do to encourage moderate Muslims to take a greater profile in the world?
Well, it seems to me that non-Muslims are doing plenty to encourage moderate Muslims, but moderate Muslims are not the people, in my view, who need to be encouraged. It's reformist Muslims. Okay? And we stumble over ourselves in this part of the world to make the distinction between extremists and moderates. Let us now put some energy into making the distinction between reformists and moderates. And I would say that, yeah, there's plenty that non-Muslims can do, but what I would want to emphasize first and foremost is please do it if you're coming from a human rights perspective and not from the perspective of bashing Islam, okay? Because I tell you, non-Muslims who think that reforming Muslims means chucking Islam, wiping it off the face of the earth, are no allies of mine, all right? So when you come from the perspective of universal human rights, that is to say that everybody on God's green earth, regardless of what religion or culture or ethnicity or community they've been born into, every individual deserves just a basic set of rights such as freedom from violence and freedom of conscience. Then you can actually link arms, okay, with reformist Muslims, and you need to identify who the real reformers are versus, the moderates. So ask a Muslim, ask your Muslim neighbor, if this is a conversation that I hope you can develop the moral courage to get into. When you say that Islam means peace, do you mean Islam in theory or Islam in the way that it's practiced? Because if you mean Islam in theory, that's cool, but let's talk about Islam in practice. Why is it, for example, that the vast majority of Muslims who have been tortured, murdered, raped, or imprisoned in the last, 50 years, and certainly the studies in Arabic language studies back up the point about the last 10 years in particular, why is it that the vast majority of Muslims who have been subjected to this kind of treatment are subjected to it by fellow Muslims? What's up with that? Okay? And the reactions of the Muslims with whom non-Muslims engage will be very important because, again, if the defenses go up right away and you're not allowed to engage, you know that something other than reform-mindedness is going on. Okay? But it is also very, very important when you are told, because you will be told, that you are engaging in Islamophobia, fear of Islam, very important, and I give these tips in the book as well, because it's really a how-to for both progressive Muslims and progressive non-Muslims. Remind people who accuse you of that if you were fearful, you'd be running away from this conversation. You wouldn't be sticking around to try and press the other person to engage in it. So again, you don't need to freeze in that moment, okay? Recognize what the stakes are, and the stakes are universality of human rights. And reflect on the tips that I give you in the book so you'll be prepared for what one would think should be and are very legitimate conversations in a pluralistic society, but actually do take the moral courage to launch into.
Earlier we got a tweet that I think gets to a lot of these tensions and questions from Ottawa Girl with a double R. Why are pictures, drawings of Prophet Muhammad forbidden? Why is it such a travesty to print them? I think getting to the whole Danish cartoon controversy, which is, I think, a great example of those questions and divisions we should be able to ask.
Well, let me just say, at the risk of offending, and I don't worry too much about that, when the whole Danish cartoon crisis happened, I needed to get some new glasses anyway, so I deliberately got Danish frames, okay, and they're very, very funky. That was just a little signal of my solidarity for Danish Muslims, and not just non-Muslims, who in the country of Denmark are working for freedom of expression. Now, about the notion that images are not of the Prophet Muhammad are not allowed. First of all, that is not true in a sect of Islam known as Shia Islam. Okay. You can even look this up on the internet. There are plenty, and they're there on the internet, plenty of images of what Shia Muslims have imagined the Prophet Muhammad to look like. This is not off the table within Shia Islam. But Shia Islam is a minority sect. The majority sect, the majority denomination is Sunni Islam. About 90% of the Muslim world is Sunni. And because Sunnis, and this was centuries ago, part of the closing of the gates of Ijtihad, decided that we do not want to risk the Prophet Muhammad becoming an idol. Since there is only one God, you are not allowed to create images of the Prophet lest he become an idol. The irony is that in trying to stop images of the Prophet Muhammad, actually Sunni Muslims have put the Prophet on a pedestal and have turned him into an idol. So again, all kinds of paradoxes going on in the name of a particular religious practice. And so what I really want to end off my answer with is this. When Muslims fulminate, as we often do, about imperialism, it's accepted and taken as a given that the imperialism that we're angry about is American imperialism and Israeli Zionist imperialism, and in India, in Pakistan, Indian Kashmiri imperialism. But notice that the way in which the Prophet Muhammad cartoon debate has been framed, as in no images of the Prophet are allowed, it's actually the imperialism of Sunni Muslims, okay, speaking on behalf of all Muslims. To me, that's a form of imperialism too. And it's not just this issue. I talk a lot in the book about how, if we're going to, again, have integrity as anti-colonialists, anti-imperialists, we Muslims have to take a look at what Muslims are doing to one another and recognize that as a form of colonization and a form of oppression within our own precincts.
Great. Let's take another question from the audience. Yes, sir? Wait for the microphone, or you got to stand. Those are the rules.
What is your background? I mean, culturally, your parents, where you come from?
Canada.
No, I mean, originally, where your parents were born.
Well, okay.
Because you came to Canada.
Sure. Now, listen, if I was born in Canada, I would still insist to you that that is my background. Mm-hmm. Turns out I wasn't born in Canada. You're lucky. You got away with this one. I was born in I'm teasing, of course, but making a bigger point, obviously. I was born in East Africa, in Uganda. Now, my parents were born in East Africa as well. But their parents, so my grandparents, on one side, on my father's side, come from the northern Indian state of Gujarat. And on my mother's side, come from southern Egypt. Their families, along with hundreds of thousands of others, were brought to East Africa by the British to help lay the colonial railroads. And that is where my sisters and I were born as well. And then we were booted out by a fellow Muslim by the name of Idi Amin in 1972. Came to Canada, as I mentioned earlier, as political refugees, and that's where I've grown up.
My question is in terms of the support that this country, and I mean American dollars, whatever their situation is financially in the world, the youth that supported the change in Egypt and in Libya, what perspective should we American voters take in terms of supporting any action there? Do we have to wait until the Libyans elect somebody or the Egyptians get themselves together? Because it doesn't seem to happen that way. It's billions of dollars in those worlds, and there are people outside in the street that are not academicians, that are not media purists or whatever you want to call them. And that's the problem, is that we want to know, where do we put our dollars and where are they going to go?
Gotcha.
Would you like to interpret that?
Well, you know what? Actually, no, it's a really interesting question because, again, as part of the trip that I made to Cairo in May 2005, I spoke with, as I mentioned, a number of young democracy activists, and one of the points that they made to me, and this obviously is not very much discussed in our newspapers, is that the money that is going from the United States, U.S. taxpayers, at the time to Egypt, is often being misused by, at the time, the Mubarak regime to, for example, pay off retired generals to shut up as hush money. And these young democracy activists were pretty upset about the fact, not just that the retired generals who were being bought off, that goes without saying, but that the U.S. government was not tracking where the money was going and not holding the regimes accountable for the money that is coming out of your pocket. So they would be, quite frankly, these young democracy activists, as angry as a U.S. taxpayer would be about how that money is being used. Now, this is complex, right? None of this stuff is, easy peasy. So I'll also point out that another thing I learned from an older democracy activist who came to New York and held a private meeting with a number of human rights activists, myself included, just a couple of years ago, early on in the Obama administration, he complained about the fact that the Obama administration quietly, secretly closed down a democracy fund that the Bush administration had paid into to, again, very, very quietly help democracy activists to further their cause. And that, according to this elder statesman who was speaking with us as human rights activists, according to him, Obama had done this, knowing full well what he was doing, as a concession to the Mubarak regime, as a way of saying, it's a new dawn. We're wanting to move all of the Bush-era mistakes off the table. Let's start clean. So this, again, is not a matter of Democrat versus Republican. Both have made their mistakes. Both have been, in many ways, very, very self-serving, right? What I would suggest is that, yes, foreign aid dollars should be going to Egypt, to Libya, but with a very close eye on where that money is going to in the spirit of anti-corruption, which is precisely the spirit in which the so-called Arab Spring has happened anyway. So to me, the two go hand in hand.
It's not a question of right versus left.
Not
It's
at
right
all.
versus wrong.
Exactly.
Let's take another question. Yes, sir. Please stand up and wait for the microphone. Oh, I'm sorry. I've been ignoring. I apologize. We will get back to you.
Okay, so my question is, there's so much dialogue about what Islam isn't, and so I was hoping that you could speak about, what is Islam and what is the essence of it, especially as a reformist, what about Islam do you think can't be reformed? What are the non-negotiables?
Right. First of all, can I just ask, are you yourself Muslim?
Yes.
Can you tell me what you would say Islam is?
I'm still trying to figure that out.
Very honest. No, that's very honest, and I thank you for that. But is there one non-negotiable for you?
I think faith in God.
And for me as well.
Right.
For me as well. And it sounds very simple, and quite frankly, it is. After all, Muslims love to point out, again, more in, sort of from a supremacy complex than anything else, that we, as monotheists, restored the idea of one God to the children of Abraham. Both the Jews and the Christians have corrupted that idea, and we are the ones who have brought this idea back. Well, in the way that we, frankly, glorify and as I said earlier, put on a pedestal, Prophet Muhammad, I think we frankly treat him as a deity when we all know that he was not just a very human messenger, but a very fallible one in his humanity. One of the big stories I tell in Allah, Liberty, and Love, and it's a story that's not very well known among ordinary Muslims, but certainly is among Islamic philosophers, it's just that nobody really goes there, is the story of the Satanic Verses. That's not the title of Salman Rushdie's book that I'm referring to, okay? He took that title from the story I'm very quickly going to tell you, which is that at one point, Prophet Muhammad accepted certain revelations that he thought were authentic, but realized later on that they actually deify, human idols. And so he took those verses back. He had his scribes withdraw them from the Quran and then blamed this on a trick played by Satan. Okay? Now, I ask in my book, but wait a minute. If the prophet himself was animated and motivated by the love of God, by God's love for him, how could Satan have even won out for just one moment? How could that have happened? And I say that when we investigate the story further, we find out that something becomes very enlightening and illuminating here, and that is the prophet at the beginning of his prophecy, of his mission, was so scared about the fact that he was being accused of shaming his tribal Arab society by pointing out all of the injustices and all of the power abuses that he made certain compromises in his mission. You can read in the book what those compromises were. And then, and of course, this is the point I'm making, part of that compromise was, including these heathen verses in the Quran because they paid tribute to pagan Arab society and to all of the idols that Arab society had. God, according to this story, intervened and said, Muhammad, basically, this is not the message I've given you. The message I've given you is that we are all equal under one God, and that special favors cannot be granted through worshiping all of these idols. Okay? People have to treat one another with justice, not rely on these idols to fulfill their destinies. It's up to us. And when the prophet got that message, that is when he withdrew these verses, and that is when the real backlash happened within Arab society towards him. The point being that moral courage was necessary for the prophet to recognize that certain of these verses, though they, again, paid homage to the people he wanted to convince to buy into his message, they paid homage to those people, the pagan Arabs, but he couldn't get all of them on side if he was going to tell the truth. And that is just the way it is. that when you've got the moral courage to point out to your own community that certain things are simply unjust, no matter what cultural rationalizations you use for them, you are going to feel the pain of the backlash. So be it. Do it non-violently, and when you do so, keep going. That's it. So?
That's the right answer.
No. The gentleman was saying, you're risking your life, though. My life was, again, as a person of faith, I believe given to me by my Creator, can be taken from me at any time. And what is the purpose, then, of living in the first place if I allow my spirit to die prematurely because my physicality may be taken away? Okay? Look, the only thing I really fear, and I'll be very honest about this, the only thing I fear is that I will die before my mother does. Because I don't want her burying me or any of her children before we bury her. That's the only thing I worry about. After that, and even before that, I'm not going to give the enemies of reason and humanity more reason to claim power than they already have. And that's why I support the voices in the Arab world that typically do not get reported in this part of the world.
You, sir, had the next question. We're going to wait for a microphone.
You said that there are conversations happening in the U.S. amongst reformist Muslims, but many of us haven't heard them. So I'd like to know where we can sort of listen in. And also, as somebody from South Asia, I'd like to know if there are such conversations happening in South Asia, particularly in Pakistan, and the hope for reform in Pakistan and tolerance.
All right. So as I'm searching for this really telling email that I got from Pakistan, let me quickly tell you that where you can eavesdrop, if you will, on reformist conversations among Muslims within America, first of all, pick up my book. And because for the last number of years, I've been on the receiving end. I've had the privilege of getting these sorts of sentiments from reform-minded Muslims, and I actually have posted them on my website for the last decade. I've responded to these messages and created a kind of a dialogue and even a multi-log with many of these folks, and it was frankly only because I had the tracking mechanism of these posts that I was able to then incorporate some of them into my book. It really worked out well. But the point is that there really, apart from chat rooms, of course, is there some grand forum in which these conversations are happening? Not yet. And there's a reason that it's not happening in that way yet, and that is fear. Now, again, there will be plenty of people who go, come on, you can't just reduce it to that. Now you're just sort of playing on other people's fears. Well, all I can tell you is that when my mother and I went to the Detroit area to screen my 2007 PBS documentary called Faith Without Fear. And why my mother? Because she's the star of the film. Okay? When we went to that area and did a screening, I was pilloried during the actual event. But afterwards, at the reception, my mother noticed out of the corner of her eye a large and ever-growing cluster of young Muslims forming in the corner of the room after all of the microphones and all of the TV cameras left. This now large group of young Muslims living in the Detroit area, American kids, come to her and they say, thank you for supporting Irshad. Thank you for not disowning her. And my mother says, she was so quick on her feet, she said, well, thank you. I really appreciate that sentiment, but why didn't you say this earlier? When there were cameras here and other Muslims could therefore see that they're not alone in thinking this way. And one of the girls, first of all, they hemmed and they hawed and they kind of looked at each other like, okay, which one of us is going to say what needs to be said? And one of the girls locked eyes with my mother and she said, Mrs. Manji, I don't think you understand. You and Irshad can leave this community 2 hours from now. We can't. And we are going to be accused of dishonoring our families if we support her in the way that you're asking us to. Now, what I find so fascinating, the word dishonor, where did that come from? It's not an American idea. That is to say, contemporary American. Again, the culture of honor very much was part of the Deep South, and in some ways still is, propping up both slavery and segregation. But their idea of dishonor, okay, came from tribal Arabia. And what is fascinating is that these kids are thoroughly American in just about every other way. Okay? Born in America. But that because of how they're being raised with the culture of group honor still being practiced in their otherwise thoroughly American family and households, they fear speaking their truth. Will that change? I certainly hope so. And that's why I do what I do. But it's there. May I just quickly read one email from Pakistan to show you as well what the stakes are and what the reality is. Okay. Awais is his name, A-W-A-I-S. That's his real name. And he writes, a few months back, one of my friends mailed me, he meant emailed me, the Urdu translation of The Trouble with Islam Today, which is my previous book. It was a pleasant surprise, mainly because I had already read the book and never mentioned it to anybody. My friend's moral courage provoked me to find some part of it in myself. I forwarded your online translation to a couple of other friends because I believe it will create a positive change in their lives. Perhaps this is how grassroots movements work. During those days, he said, an Islamist at my workplace mailed the whole office a speech from a Taliban representative. It was so outrageous that it forced me to rethink my strategy of remaining silent. I have been blogging since that day to promote free thought and rationalism. Also, me and my friends spend time having useful discussions with the rest of our friends, which may push them to raise questions and think freely. So, there's hope at the same time as there's fear. Yet understand that Awais got access to the Urdu translation of The Trouble with Islam Today, not because it was on the bookshelves in that country. In fact, it was published in that country, but the week it was published, the ulama, the religious scholars, so-called, issued a fatwa against all of the booksellers who were selling that book. The book was therefore cleared from their shelves, but because my website was already, very well known, I simply posted the Urdu translation on my site for free of charge download. That is how Awais got access to those ideas, and that is how he managed also to share those ideas with his friends. Once again, a fascinating time to be a reformist within my faith.
The best time.
I think so. And the time. If not now, when?
Exactly. Let's take one question more from the Twitterverse, and then I think we have time for one or two more from the audience.
We have a tweet that just came in from El Shaw, who asks, how do we shift the conversation so that in 2021 the current debate seems dated?
I think that's what this conversation has been about. I think, again, it's about recognizing that moral and cultural relativism, the notion that everything in everybody's culture is just fine because that's the way they do it, is an outdated notion. That there is, in this increasingly, again, interconnected planet of ours, there is such a thing as just basic universal standards of human dignity and human decency in terms of how we treat one another. And so developing the moral courage to instigate, not even just participate in, instigate, start those conversations on your campuses, at the family dinner table, in the mosques and the madrasas, with your neighbors. Start those conversations and take the tips that I offer in Allah, Liberty, and Love, not to freeze in the moment that you yourself are challenged, but to recognize that, if democracy is to mean anything healthy, it's got to mean that those of us who have had the privilege of 200 plus years of developing it actually use it. not wait for our politicians to do that. Their job is to get reelected. Ain't much moral courage going to happen there, okay? It's we ordinary citizens, both of this country and, frankly, of the world, who have to claim that privilege and that power, that courage to start these conversations ourselves.
That is what tonight's about. That's exactly right. We have time for one or two more questions. I saw the gentleman in the red raise his hand earlier.
So first, I wanted to thank you for this talk and for all the work you've been doing. You've told a few stories of teenagers, Muslim teenagers here in America, who say that they cannot leave their culture. They cannot leave their neighborhood or their parents or whatever it is. And I'm wondering how you react to them. I hope you say to them that, yes, they can do that. And if you don't, I wonder why. And I think a model to look at is is the gay and lesbian community. Is that I think people growing up gay and lesbian, especially in cultures where it's not okay, even here in the States, they have left. I worked in the gay marriage movement in Massachusetts, and I met a lot of people who left their home. And it's terrifying, but it's inspiring. So just want to hear your thoughts on that.
So, okay, great question. And let me clarify that what I, again, find very hopeful in the conversations I have with, Muslim teenagers who wish to move forward in their own lives is that they're not saying that they can't leave their culture. First of all, it's not their culture at all. It's their parents' culture. And they make that distinction for me. That's how I've learned, oh, yeah, that's right. You define yourself as an American, don't you? You define yourself as a European, don't you? Okay, I'm getting it now, right? That is where the hope, in part, comes for me, is that it's not that I need to, or people like me need to create reformist Muslims. It's that I have the opportunity and the challenge to show them how they can begin having these conversations with their parents, with their elders, with their so-called community leaders. And I'm not in favor, to be honest, of children leaving their families unless they believe that their own integrity, their own basic human dignity is at stake. That is to say, if a Muslim teenager is just realizing that, okay, there is simply no way that I can achieve my human wholeness if I stay in the dysfunction of this household, then I say, okay, find a constructive way to leave. But leave you must. At some point anyway, you're going to have to. That I get. I had to do it myself, by the way, but not in any kind of hostile way. My mother was devastated when I moved away from home to take a job elsewhere. But, she grew up in that kind of a culture where you don't do that unless you get married, and Irshad wasn't about to get married. So I had to deal with that myself. But if the point is that actually we are perhaps, as Muslims, underestimating what our parents are capable of and willing to incrementally have difficult dialogues with them, ease them into the reality of what it is to have your humanity be whole. Not theirs. You're not them. They're not you. If you're willing to go there, then I say try that first. Because frankly, that's the way it will be positive, a positive experience for them, for their Muslim kids to reconcile faith and freedom. Otherwise, it really does become a showdown. The two become mutually exclusive. And my whole life is about not having to be either or, but to reconcile the both and.
Reconciling faith and freedom. Let's take one more question I believe we have back there. Whoever's closest to the microphone. You already have the microphone. That's even better.
So first of all, thank you so much for your talk. I found the idea of the whole moral courage project very heartening. My question is about your critique of liberal Muslims who do not acknowledge the Islamic roots of certain heinous crimes. I think we are all very aware that bigotry garbed in religious actions and religious language has done so much wrong in this world, and at the same time we know that religion is a source of hope and it has done so much good as well. So I don't really understand why you would want to say that such and such violent act is Islamic rather than a Muslim has done such and such.
Well, then that's a failure in my communication, because I actually don't say that it is Islamic. If I felt it was, I couldn't remain a Muslim with integrity. Okay? But I do not believe that these crimes are Islamic in nature. What I have to, though, acknowledge, if I'm going to be honest, is that they are often committed in the name of Islam. That's very important to recognize. And therefore, there is some religious inspiration behind the motives. Let me again give you a very quick example. There is a verse in the Quran, chapter 5, verse 32, that most moderates, who, by the way, are not liberals at all, and I'll explain that in just a second as well, but most moderates, when they even recognize that this verse exists, say, all this verse tells us is that if you kill a human being, it's like killing all of mankind. You see, so, it's not Islamic at all, because Islam is against killing anybody. What they don't tell you, sometimes because they don't know, and sometimes because they do know and just don't want to own up to it, is that the verse actually is longer. It states, if you kill a human being, unless you are killing that human being as punishment for murder or other villainy in the land, gee, you think, you think that's vague? Okay? Unless you are killing that human being for murder, as punishment for murder or other villainy in the land, only then would it be like killing all of mankind. In other words, this clause beginning with the word except or unless is an escape hatch. It's a loophole that extremists use, and by the way, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they? Of course they can use that. So if we say, oh, no, this has nothing to do with Islam, we're lying. We're lying to others and we're lying to ourselves. What I say is that even as we acknowledge that this verse exists and is being actively used by violent extremists, we should be putting forth, as liberal Muslims, bold, competing reinterpretations of the very verses that are being used in violent ways. So, for example, if we take this verse, if you kill a human being, it's like killing all of mankind unless you are killing that human being as punishment for murder or other villainy in the land. Why don't we ever, as Muslims, define villainy in the land as what Muslims are doing to one another? Okay? Why is it always, U.S. blueprints in Saudi soil or Israeli occupation of the Palestinians? It may be that too, but why is it that we never acknowledge that what we do to one another is also villainy in the land? And if we acknowledge that and define that in terms of this verse, then we've got to realize that the counter-narrative here to the jihadist narrative is to point out that we've got to eliminate, the appeal of the extremist ideology within our faith. And we can only do that when moderates step up to the plate and become reformists. And why aren't they liberal right now? They're actually conservative, okay? Because they're seeking to conserve one strand of a very multifaceted identity that makes up you. For moderates, all they are, when it comes to engaging with non-Muslims or liberal Muslims like myself, all they are is Muslims. And so if you ask anything that remotely makes them uncomfortable, they're emotionally, they take it as their humanity being assaulted. No, your humanity is not being even challenged. I respect and engage your humanity. That's why I take the time to have this conversation. Okay? It's your sliver of identity that may be challenged here. And who decides what that identity means? How have you come to decide that there is only a particular purity that can define what you are as a Muslim. Who did you get that from? Did you come up with it yourself? Maybe, but maybe not. That's why I say in the book, there's a difference between identity, which is a social construct that often others assign to you in order to put you in your place and let you know who you are and what you believe, and you shall be none other than this. There's a difference between identity and integrity. Identity other people give you, and you decide if you'll accept it. Integrity you give to yourself, and nobody can take that away from you. Khalas.
The book is Allah, Liberty, and Love. Irshad Manji, thank you for your courage to reconcile faith and freedom.
My role is merely quickly to remind you all that Irshad will be staying with us longer, signing this marvelous book. Just to our right, there's a reception as well, so visit with one another. On behalf of Dean Ellen Shaw, who I think has to be the first dean in the history of schools like ours to tweet a question from an event, on behalf of NYU Wagner School, and on behalf of all those who practice, exhibit moral courage in ways both large and small, thanks to Irshad Manji and John Avlon.